Good evening. For those that are just now joining, I'm Taylor Gillespie. I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's call. We are recording tonight's call, so you will be able to access this on our website after the webinar, and we'll share the link for that in the chat as well as on some slides. We're here tonight because our mission at EPA is to protect human health and the environment, and we are concerned about health risks from a specific source of air pollution in Sandy, Utah. I want to share a couple things about myself before we get started tonight. I want you to know two things about me, which I believe will tell you more about how I'll moderate this meeting tonight than just telling you my job title here at EPA. The first is that I grew up in a very small town with parents who were a teacher and a nurse and a part of the heart of that town. And so I understand how important it is that we share risk information with you all and that we answer your questions tonight. The second is that I'm an Army veteran, and I hope to use skills from my experience and background to show you the respect and empathy you deserve, but also I want to keep us on target tonight. Make sure that your questions get answered and that we communicate clearly about what we know and how we are working to address it. This may mean asking you to clarify your questions using the Q&A module, or asking our speakers to readdress something that I feel is unclear. For several reasons that my colleague they'll talk about more throughout the rest of the night, this is a tough issue to communicate. And so I want to acknowledge that this is not an easy conversation we are going to have tonight. We are going to answer questions at various points throughout the webinar. So please type your questions into the Q&A module. That is right in the center of your screen. You can start typing in questions at any time. And we have a team of folks that are going to work to get back to you, but also we are going to ask some questions out loud throughout the presentation. If we don't get to your question tonight, please know that you can email us at eto@epa.gov. Also, if you are just now joining us and you would prefer to hear tonight's presentation in Spanish, please click the globe or the interpretation button. Catherine, if you could just go back to that interpretation slide really quickly. So for folks that want to listen to tonight's webinar in Spanish, we have live translation going on, and you can access that by clicking the globe or the interpretation button and then selecting Spanish. With that, I'm going to turn it over to EPA Regional Administrator Casey Becker. In her role, she helps set strategic priorities like addressing air pollution for EPA Region 8, which covers Utah, along with Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota. Casey?
Thanks, Taylor. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you all tonight. My name is Casey Becker, and I'm the Regional Administrator for EPA Region 8. Thank you for taking time to join us to learn more about this issue. We're here tonight to talk about air pollution from a chemical called ethylene oxide being emitted from BD Medical. As my colleagues will discuss in more detail, ethylene oxide can cause health risks, but it's also an important chemical used at medical sterilizer facilities to ensure the safety of a wide variety of medical devices that are used by doctors, hospitals, and dentists. There are about 100 commercial sterilizers around the country, and some of them are emitting ethylene oxide into the outdoor air at a level that is concerning. Tonight reflects the next steps in our continued commitment to share and deliver updated information about community risk. EPA is sharing this information now so that you have access to the same information that we have at EPA and can make informed decisions about risks and your health. We're dedicated to keeping you informed through the process of reducing risk. Next slide. Before we get into details, I want to first share EPA's perspective on what the three main takeaways are tonight. First, risk surrounding BD Medical is too high, and EPA remains concerned about this risk. Second, EPA is committed to protecting health in communities facing risk from ethylene oxide, and we're taking this issue seriously. EPA is working closely with BD Medical, the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, Sandy City officials, and the Utah Department of Health and Human Services to address concerns about ETO in Sandy, Utah. Third, you deserve to be a part of this process, to have your voices heard, your concerns shared, and your needs met. We will share more information about next steps later on in the meeting, but you can find more details about everything we will talk about tonight, including how to make your voice heard, on EPA's website at the link we're putting on the slide now. Next slide. Mostly what you are going to hear tonight is about risk to people who live near these facilities, but EPA is also looking at how ETO might be impacting people who work at or go to school near commercial sterilizers across the nation. We'll have more information about our efforts in the coming months. While EPA commits to working to reduce risk near these facilities, we are also not the only government agency working on this issue. We're partnering closely with our federal, state, and local colleagues to make sure we understand and consider the needs of communities, businesses, the healthcare industry, and workers. Most importantly, tonight, we are co-presenting with the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, who will share information on the work they're doing to help EPA with reducing emissions from the facility and understanding the health risks for your community. Again, we thank you for attending tonight. My staff and I are engaged and available to answer your questions and concerns. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us after this meeting and in the future. I'll now turn the presentation over to Madeline Beal. She's EPA's Senior Risk Advisor. Madeline?
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Casey. I'm going to share some information tonight about the chemical ethylene oxide. And I'm also going to talk about some of the health risks that are associated with this chemical. But before I do that, I want to share that I understand what Taylor said at the front, that this might be upsetting or frustrating. While I work for EPA, I'm also a mom of 4 young children. And as I have learned about this issue, as I have worked on this issue, I have myself been concerned about how it would feel to be in the audience tonight and learn that there might be a risk to my family. I personally feel like I have to know a lot and I have to balance a lot of different things to make decisions to help my family have the best possible future. And this will likely feel like a new challenge to learn about and consider as you're making choices for your own families. And I just want to validate that it's completely reasonable if you feel scared or upset or angry at any of this information. A big part of my job is to help explain risk to community members who might be impacted by that risk. And I have the job that I have because I believe strongly that this communication is important. For us to best protect health, we need to share the information that we have with you all, but we need to do that in a way that's understandable and that can help inform decisions that you might be making. So this is part of why we have a lot of time set aside for questions tonight. If we say things that are hard to follow, if we get too technical and the language it doesn't make sense to you, please let us know that in the Q&A module so that we can take time to explain things in a different way. You've already heard that we're talking about air pollution from a chemical called ethylene oxide. And we often refer to ethylene oxide as ETO. I think we may have already called it ETO a couple of times tonight. Sometimes you'll also hear folks call it EO. But whether you're calling it ETO, EO, or ethylene oxide, that's all the same chemical. And it's exactly the same issue. You usually can't smell or see ETO in the amounts that we find it in the air near facilities or in communities. ETO is used to kill bacteria and other germs. Specifically, it's used to sterilize medical equipment and spices. BD's facility in Sandy, Utah uses ETO to sterilize IV lines, as well as some other products that are used in hospitals. ETO is typically the only type of sterilization that can really work for IV lines and some other sensitive medical products like IV lines. ETO comes out of this facility. If we could do the next slide, please. ETO comes out of this facility as air pollution only. There's no indication that we have to suggest that ETO is coming out into the water or onto the ground or the soil in any way that would cause risk. And also worth noting is that when it comes to short-term health benchmarks, we haven't seen any evidence that the ethylene oxide that's coming out of this facility would be causing urgent or acute health issues like nausea, dizziness, or breathing problems to people who live nearby. This is an important point. The science that we have done is only points to risk from a long-term exposure based on the best current knowledge that we have of what's happening here in Sandy. And then a final point is that as a consumer, typically you don't have to be worried about the risk that might be from ETO that's left over on the product that was sterilized with it. If you go to the hospital and you need an IV, You don't have to worry about the ETO that might be still on that IV. The risk we're concerned about here is risk to people who live near or work at this facility. So if the things on this slide are sort of the things that we're not worried about, let's talk a little more about the things that EPA is concerned about. So what we've learned is that ethylene oxide can cause cancer when people are exposed to it over long periods of time. At EPA, we have sort of a specific definition for what we mean from long periods of time. And what we mean is when people breathe ETO at the levels that we see from birth until the age 70, 100% of the time. So every single day, 24 hours a day from birth until age 70. When you breathe that much ETO, we can see an increase, or we predict an increase in breast and lymph or blood cancers. So next slide, please. Some people are more at risk from ETO. So this can either happen because that person is exposed to more ETO because they're spending more time in areas where there's a lot of it, or it can occur. So this could be with, a worker who might work at a facility. Oftentimes they might be exposed to more ETO. But children and babies are also a good example of a group that might be more susceptible to ETO, and they are more vulnerable to it. So my colleague Carrie is going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But at EPA, because we know children are more susceptible to ETO, we explicitly consider that in our analysis, so that when we make rules to limit the amount of ETO, those rules will be protective of children. So I want to provide just a little bit of national context, so you all can understand how the facility in Sandy, Utah fits in with the rest of what's going on around the country. There are about 100 commercial sterilizers in the country. You can see where they are located on the map here with the dots. We also, you can also find this map or be able to find this map in the materials that we share online. The blue dots on this map show the locations of the 23 sterilizers where we anticipate that the risk would be highest to the people who live nearby. As Casey indicated, we're focusing a lot of the conversation today on people who live near the BD medical facility. We do believe that there is increased risk to people who live nearby, but I also want to be clear that there is potential risk for people who work or go to school near some of these other sterilizers as well. And when we think about the big picture on how we're going to reduce risk from ETO, we're looking at all 100 sterilizers to propose solutions that will reduce risk. The information that we're sharing tonight and that we've posted on the web is all based on information that we have collected from facilities, including BD Medical. They have shared updated information about their processes and how much ETO they use. And that is what we're using to help understand where risk might be. But we're also going to keep collecting information, and we're going to keep verifying information. And if we can continue, if we collect and verify more information from the facility, or we learn things from other sources, we will be able to update you on the website as well. So we will share that information as we collect it to give, hopefully give you a more updated picture on where risk is. Many facilities around the country are already taking action to reduce ethylene oxide pollution. Many others are planning to do more to reduce it. And BD Medical is one of those facilities. They are taking actions to reduce risk. And my colleague Carrie will talk a little more about those in a moment. So while we're concerned about risk in Sandy, it's also helpful to know that ETO is not a chemical that lasts for very long in the environment. So what this means is that if we can reduce the amount of ETO that comes out of this facility, we will reduce that risk right away for the community. So I just want to close on a couple of thoughts about things that you might want to think about if you're wanting to try to understand what this risk might mean for you and your family. At EPA, when we calculate risk, when we do our analysis, we do it on a population level. And what that means is we take a hypothetical idea of whether if 1 million people were exposed for 70 years, and then we think about risk in those terms. That doesn't necessarily really easily translate to what does it mean to me individually? Am I personally at risk? And so if you want to start to sort of think about your risk in those terms, there are 3 things that you really need to consider. One is how close are you to the facility? The further away you are from the facility, the lower the risk will be. The second is how much ETO is coming out of the facility. And then the third is how long have you been breathing in this ETO near the facility, both in terms of the years that you have spent in your neighborhood, but also in the numbers of hours each day that you might spend near the facility. EPA is very much working on this second bullet, how much ETO is coming out of the facility. Because if we can reduce that amount of ETO coming out of the facility, that's really the best way to make the community safer. I want to turn things back to Taylor to see if we have any questions already that I can answer now before we hear from our next speaker.
Thanks, Madeline. So I want to just acknowledge that it seems like our Spanish interpretation channel is having some issues. Some folks have reached out saying that they're not hearing our interpreters. So I've checked in with them. We are trying to get that sorted out. We did post the Spanish slides, the slides that have been translated into Spanish in the chat for everyone. So you should be able to access those, and we will certainly follow up and we will send a note as soon as we can get that interpretation channel running again. I also want to remind folks that you can use this Q&A module. Many people have already found it. We have several questions in here, but we are going to stop at several points and answer questions using this Q&A module. So it's right in the center of your screen. It says Q&A. It has like 2 little message bubbles next to it, and you can type questions into us, and we'll either work to get back to you directly or we'll ask some of them out loud. Madeline, a couple of questions that we got while you were talking is, do we know how long ETO remains in the air? You kind of mentioned before, it kind of disappears. Do you have any sense of that?
I don't have the exact number on the top of my head, but it's at most a couple of weeks, but it does dissipate pretty quickly. And it also travels with the weather. So it's a little bit, it's not an exact answer, but it's not something that's like a persistent chemical. So sometimes at EPA, we deal with chemicals that are really hard to get rid of. Ethylene oxide is very much not that way. So if we can reduce the amount coming out of the facility, which is what we are actively working to do, then we can get those risk numbers down.
Great. The other question we got was talking about having consulted with FDA. Are we working with FDA to understand, their concerns or interest in relation to this issue?
Yeah, so ethylene oxide, it's complicated from a regulatory space. So I don't want to get too in the weeds in terms of the bureaucracy of the thing, but there's several federal agencies that have a role in helping understand how ETO can and should be used. So FDA is one of those agencies. FDA's interest is in making sure that medical supplies are safe when they enter the market. If you go to the hospital, you want to be certain that the IV that you get is not going to have bacteria or viruses or germs in it. And so FDA oversees that and makes recommendations about what processes need to be taken to make sure that there's safety in the medical supply. The question was not directly about this, but we also work with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they are concerned about worker risk. And so they work, they're also on the task force. There's an interagency task force that we sit on with those 2 agencies, as well as ATSDR, which is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And they do a lot of work to understand where cancer might be in America, but also make recommendations about how to reduce risk, but also inform communities about risk and work closely with doctors on those issues as well.
Great. And then one last question. Are there any alternatives that any of these commercial sterilizers, but specifically this facility, could be using outside of ETO?
So there is a lot of active work on that. FDA especially is working on this issue, and part of EPA is also working with FDA to understand if there might be ways to use less ETO to get some of the same safe results. But the bottom line is there aren't a lot of great alternatives for some of these products. Their radiation can work to sterilize some things, but radiation doesn't go super deep into a piece of equipment. So it doesn't work for everything. And heat and steam are used to sterilize a lot of things, but most of the things that are sterilized with ETO right now can't be sterilized with heat or steam, or they would already be being sterilized that way.
Great. Thanks, Madeline. So now we're going to turn things over to Carrie Hicks. Carrie works on air toxics in EPA's Region 8 office. Carrie?
All right. Thank you, Taylor. Hi, everyone. I'm Kerry Hicks with EPA Region 8, located in Denver, Colorado. I'm here to share some of the more localized picture for your community. First, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I'm an Army engineer, Army veteran, and an engineer. So when I speak, I'm to the point and pragmatic. I'm passionate about the work I do because I believe this work can and does help reduce risk in communities like yours in Sandy. The best solution to reducing risk is to reduce the amount of ETO coming out of this facility. Here are the two main things that the EPA is doing. First, we are updating the air pollution regulation that limits how much of this chemical that facilities like this one can put into the air. But this takes time. So secondly, we are working with Utah Department of Environmental Quality, the City of Sandy, local health officials, and BD Medical to reduce the amount of ETO coming out of this facility as soon as possible. Unfortunately, there are not many actions that you can personally take to reduce risk. This isn't a chemical that you can easily remove with home air filters or completely reduce your risk by staying inside. Spending less time near these facilities would reduce your risk, but again, the best solution is to reduce the amount of ETO coming out of the facility. I'm going to share a little more detail about the analysis we have completed and what it tells us about this facility. EPA scientists analyzed the best information and data available, some of which we collected from the facilities, and we combined it with other local information like weather patterns and the locations of homes. Using these factors, we were able to calculate health risks from this chemical. I want to note that our analysis only reflects your health risk related to this specific chemical from this specific source. To estimate risk from a given chemical, we need to know how toxic the chemical is, how much there is in the air, and how long throughout a person's life someone might be exposed to it. EPA's analysis needs to be protective of health, so some of our estimates are on the extremely high end. We assume that people spend all of their time in the area where there is risk elevated, which means we assume people are sitting on their front porch with direct exposure 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from birth to age 70. Those might not be realistic assumptions for you, but at EPA, we want to be protective of public health, even for a person who does not spend their entire life near the facility. This map shows you the results of the analysis we did for BD Medical located in Sandy, Utah. The map we are showing is our most current understanding of risk from the facility, but we know that the facility has plans to upgrade the pollution control system, and the system should be working and tested by March 2023. We will update the webpage for this facility when these changes occur. I want to point out a few features on the map. The dark yellow box is the facility itself. The blue area includes residential areas where risks are at or above 101 million. You can also see some streets on this map that may help orient you. Close to the center of both maps is the BD Medical Facility. To the west, you'll see I-15. You can also see State Street or Highway 89 just east of the facility. Jordan High School is to the southeast, and Rio Tinto Stadium is to the north. In the blue area, the darker shading reflects higher risk and lighter shading, lower risk, albeit still at or above 100 in a million. Note that as you move away from the facility, the blue shading is lighter, meaning the risk gets lower. There is some uncertainty in these estimates as both operations at the facility and weather can change. But these are the best health protective estimates we have available. We use 100 in a million as our benchmark for identifying whether risks are considered higher and are of concern to the EPA. When we say 100 in a million, we are saying that we estimate ETO exposure could contribute to an increase of 100 cancer cases if 1 million people were exposed at those levels for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from birth to age 70. We start our calculations at birth because we want to make sure we are protective of children. We use 1 million people as a baseline for how we calculate risk, but that is a lot larger population than the number of people living near this facility. Near this facility, there are a little more than 700 people living in the higher risk area. The higher risk in this area is 3,000 and 1,000,000 closest to the facility. This again would be in addition to the risk of getting cancer for other reasons. We want to acknowledge that there are other sources of ETO that you encounter on a daily basis. For instance, it is created in your own body. However, this analysis is focused on risk coming directly from this facility, and we are calculating risk that is over and above other sources. I would like to take a step back just for a minute and explain where this pollution is coming from, because this information is important to understand how solutions can be put into place to reduce risk. There are two types of ways that ETO can leave a facility. The first is that ETO is used to sterilize things. It is sucked into a control system. These systems remove ETO out of the air before releasing a much smaller amount out of the facility through a stack. This type of ETO coming out of the facility is called controlled emissions. BD Medical has controls on several processes at their facility. Their sterilization chambers and primary aeration rooms are controlled and pass through control devices that are required by state permits and federal standards. The second type of ETO emissions are those that don't get sucked into control systems. It is ETO that escapes through other places, leaks, vents, windows, and doors. This escaping ETO is sometimes called fugitive emissions. At BD Medical, a majority of the risk from the facility comes from these fugitive emissions from the warehouse relief bins. BD Medical has plans to voluntarily upgrade their fugitive capture system by December and have it tested by March 2023. The facility is also undergoing a process optimization study, which will reduce the amount of ETO in each cycle. These two efforts will result in a 90% reduction in emissions and will address risk concerns. Although BD Medical is taking voluntary measures to reduce emissions from their facility, the EPA is taking measures to reduce risk from facilities like BD Medical nationwide. We are working on two rules that will aim to lower emissions from BD Medical from medical sterilization facilities nationwide, especially from previously unregulated fugitive emissions. These rules will be proposed in the coming months. The regulatory process takes time. After the rule is proposed, there is a 90-day public comment period. After that, the EPA has a year to address public comments and then finalize the rule. After the rule is finalized, companies have 3 years to come into compliance with the new regulation. We understand that this is a slow process and may not be satisfactory to everyone, and that is why we are working with local officials and companies nationwide to address these concerns ahead of the rulemaking. Next, I'm going to talk about what has happened so far and what to expect from us. While this analysis of exactly where risk is recent, we have been working on ETO at EPA for much longer. This slide shares some of the key points on that work. We've had regulations in place for ETO emissions for over 30 years. In 2016, because of updated science, we learned that ETO was more dangerous than we originally thought. In 2018, a national level analysis provided an initial indication of which areas might have higher risk, but it wasn't detailed enough to inform regulation, and BD Medical did not show up in that analysis because the resolution of this study was not refined enough. EPA recognized that we still needed to collect additional data, not only at this facility, but nationwide, to learn more about the use of ETO and what the solutions are to prevent risk. That work brings us to where we are today. I also want to note that while we very recently gathered this more refined picture of the operations at BD Medical, the risk has occurred since operations started at the facility in 2007. Our risk estimates shown represent current and not historical conditions. This information is what we will use to set regulations going forward to be more protective of health across the nation. I want to summarize some of our key points in plain language, because I know we've thrown a lot of information at you already. EPA is working on 2 different rules to reduce emissions from facilities like BD Medical. These take time, but will reduce risk in communities across the nation that have commercial sterilizers in their backyards. BD Medical has plans to reduce their emissions, and that should be in place and tested by spring of 2023. This should address all our concerns at the EPA. We are sharing these risk results with you so you have the same information we have. You can submit questions via the ETO at epa.gov and sign up to receive notifications at www.epa.gov/ETO. I will now turn the presentation over to our partners in this effort, the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Eady. Rachel.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everybody. I am Rachel Eady. I work for the Utah Division of Air Quality as a modeler and scientist. And although I'm a relatively new transplant to Salt Lake City, DAQ has employees that live in Sandy, and some are very close to the BD Medical facility. So this issue is very real to us and helped motivate a more in-depth sampling campaign that I'm here to speak about. Last year, DAQ scientist Dr. Nancy Daher and University of Utah professor Dr. Rod Handy were awarded federal funding to study ETO for medical commercial sterilizers in our region, of which there are 2. This study includes 3 main objectives. The first is ambient monitoring of ethylene oxide levels at 16 sites in or near Salt Lake County. Ambient air is collected for 24 hours in stainless steel canisters, like the one that's pictured here attached to a light pole, and then chemically analyzed in a third-party lab. This past winter, we collected samples at 11 sites near the facilities, 8 of which were near BD Medical, and also at 5 background sites in order to better understand how ethylene oxide varies in our region. The second part of the study looks at possible seasonality and ethylene oxide ambient levels by sampling for 3 days or every 3 days for 8 weeks in both the winter time and the summertime. We just completed our summer sampling in the middle of September. And finally, Dr. Rod Handy and his group will complete a health risk assessment and compare their modeled values to those that we gathered in the field. This is a map with locations of our winter monitoring sites. Blue dots, like the one just north of Tooele, represent background sites. The red dots indicate sampling sites near the Sterigenics facility, which is in an industrial area by the airport. And the green dots represent BD Medical. The zoomed in map on the right shows the BD Medical facility with a little red star, and the measurement sites as dots, which are sized by the average ethylene oxide concentration that we measured during our winter sampling period. These preliminary results are consistent with EPA modeling, which shows the highest ethylene oxide impacts near the facility. So this is a more detailed summary of the winter sampling results, just to highlight how ethylene oxide concentrations can vary. To orient you, the horizontal x-axis represents the different sampling sites, which are split into BD Medical with green shading and background sites with blue shading. The vertical y-axis is the concentration of ethylene oxide in parts per billion. The dots within the box plot show the mean ethylene oxide value at that sampling site, which is similar to the previous map, while the shaded areas and the whiskers of the plot highlight the variability and range at each site. BD medical sites generally have higher values closer to the facility than the background sites, but all measured values that we've recorded are below the threshold for immediate health risk. So to recap, we do not have final results for our monitoring study yet, as we only have final data for the wintertime portion, and the summer sampling campaign just wrapped up. Additionally, the University of Utah Health Assessment is ongoing. I'd also like to add some caveats to the results so far. Laboratory measurements of ethylene oxide are still difficult to do well. While we have confidence in the higher concentration measurements, the lower concentration samples, like those in background sites, have higher uncertainty. Our measurements are also a snapshot in time and are not reflective of a person's exposure for their entire lifetime. But I just want to highlight again that our measured concentrations are higher closer to the facilities, lower at background sites, and are consistent with the EPA risk modeling for impacted neighborhoods. Our monitoring team was out in the winter cold and the summer heat to get great measurements for the study, but we still have some data analysis and a health assessment to do. We anticipate having a final report in September of next year. So in the meantime, and Carrie has touched on this, what's being done? In the few years that ethylene oxide has been known as a higher risk pollutant, BD Medical has been working to reduce their ethylene oxide emissions ahead of the proposed federal regulations. They updated their permit with DAQ, and emission control upgrades are already in progress, with planned completion and verification by next spring. These additional controls are expected to yield a 90% reduction of total ethylene oxide emissions. For more information, check out our website or shoot us an email at deqinfo@utah.gov. And now I'll turn the time over to Dr. Alejandra Maldonado.
Thank you, Rachel. Great, can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Excellent. Hi, I'm Dr. Alejandra Maldonado. I'm the state toxicologist at the Utah Department of Health and Human Services in the Environmental Epidemiology program. Tonight, I'm going to be covering the steps that the health department is going to be taking to address community concerns related to ethylene oxide at this site. So just a little bit of background information about the Environmental Epidemiology program. So the goal of our program is to serve the public by using the best environmental science to provide accurate health information and taking public health actions to prevent harmful exposures and diseases related to toxic substances. So how can ethylene oxide affect your health? Most of the information about the human health effects from exposure to ethylene oxide comes from occupational and animal toxicity studies. From these studies, we know that chronic exposure to ethylene oxide can cause both non-cancer and cancer health effects. Common health effects observed in workers exposed to ethylene oxide for several years include irritation of the eyes, skin, and lungs, and effects to the nervous system, such as headaches, nausea, memory loss, and numbness. I'd like to emphasize that the levels at which workers are exposed to ethylene oxide is much higher compared to the general public. Current data from EPA's risk assessment show that the levels in air around BD Medical were well below those known to cause non-cancer health effects.
Alejandra, if I could just interrupt for just a second, our
Sure.
our interpreters are asking if you slow down just a little bit for
Sure.
the interpretation. Thanks.
Yep. Occupational studies also indicate that humans with long-term, meaning years or decades, cumulative exposure to ethylene oxide are at an increased risk of certain types of cancers. These cancers include blood cancers, such as lymphoma, leukemia, and myeloma, and breast cancer in women. These occupational studies are supported by evidence from experimental animal toxicity data. Current data from EPA's risk assessment does show an elevated lifetime cancer risk in the immediate area surrounding BD Medical. So what does it mean to have an elevated lifetime cancer risk? As my colleagues at EPA have already mentioned, in this case, it means that someone exposed to ethylene oxide over many years has an increased risk of developing cancer compared to someone not exposed to ethylene oxide. I'd like to emphasize that these are theoretical cancer risk estimates or the likelihood of developing cancer over a lifetime. And they are meant to be conservative values in order to be protective of public health, especially our most vulnerable populations, such as children and pregnant women. Cancer risk estimates are simply a tool to help guide public health action and make recommendations to protect people from harmful exposures. They should not be interpreted as an accurate prediction of the exact number of cancer cases that actually occur or used to determine if an individual will develop cancer. Whether or not someone develops health issues from exposure to ethylene oxide depends on several factors. These factors include how much, how long, and how often a person is exposed to ethylene oxide, and in this case, how close to a source. In addition, a person's general health, genetics, age, family history, lifestyle choices, and other environmental exposures may also play a role. Our investigation of the site will be composed of two parts. The first part is a risk assessment, or what we call a health consultation. We will be using the monitoring data collected by our partners at the Department of Environmental Quality to look at both non-cancer and cancer health effects from exposure to ethylene oxide. Our models allow us the flexibility to look at children and adults separately and take a closer look at site-specific exposure scenarios in the surrounding community. Based on the results of our report findings, we will provide some public health recommendations for the community, our partners, and stakeholders. The second part of our assessment will be a cancer statistical review. The purpose of this type of study is to determine if cancer rates are higher than expected, quantify the magnitude of cancer rates, and assess the temporal trend in cancer rates in a specified population. This type of study is not able to link cancer cases to specific causes. We will be focusing only on ethylene oxide associated cancers. Again, that's lymphoma, leukemia, myeloma in both men and women, and breast cancer in women only. The specific questions that this report will address are determining if there are more cases of ethylene oxide associated cancers in the area of interest than expected when compared to the rest of Utah, and what the trends of ethylene oxide associated cancers over time. We anticipate beginning our assessment in the upcoming spring of 2023. To keep you informed and up to date with our investigation, we've created a webpage where you can access any documents or reports related to the investigation, including a copy of this presentation from tonight's meeting. At the bottom of the page, you can also find health education materials related to ethylene oxide and additional resources for the public and clinicians. If you have additional questions or concerns related to the health assessment or cancer statistical review, please feel free to reach out via email at appletree@utah.gov or you can also visit our website at appletree.utah.gov and click on Contact at the top of the page. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn back the time over to our colleagues at EPA.
Thanks, Alejandra. We're going to have all of our presenters come back on, and I'm going to get them pinned up here on the screen. So give me just a second to do that. And then we're going to transition to questions and answers. Great. And Catherine, if you can throw up the slide for folks to be able to type those question and answers just for a minute. So I want to remind folks that we are taking questions and we will be asking some of those out loud. If you put them into that Q&A module, that is in the bottom middle of your screen. We've gotten several dozen questions so far, and we've got a team of folks that are responding directly. We're going to ask some questions out loud. So please keep using that, and we're going to be here until we can try to answer as many of those questions as possible. It looks like, Madeline, you're not pinned yet, so give me just a second and see. There we go. All right, you should be up there now. Okay, so we've got a couple questions in the Q&A. One of the first ones, Madeline, hopefully you can answer this, but there's a lot of questions wanting to know about compliance status. Specifically, is BD Medical currently in compliance with state and federal regulations?
So I can't speak directly personally to any one facility in compliance, but I think I can speak to sort of a bigger national question that might be behind that, which is that we hear sometimes from communities that there's a sense of disconnect from what we're saying, right? Where we're saying the risk is too high and we're concerned about the risk. But then the fact is many of the facilities across the country are in full compliance with the current law. And the reason for that is that the current regulation we have, the current rule that we have, is not protective enough. And we know that, which is why we're here tonight, but also why we are rewriting the regulation that my colleague Carrie talked about to make sure that it is more protective. There are a couple of reasons why the rule isn't protective, the existing rule isn't protective enough, but the biggest one is that we've learned that ETO is much more toxic than we knew it was, but also that there are different sort of particulars of the source of ETO that are driving risk in places like Sandy. And so we want to make sure those new regulations take those things that we know now into account and to bring that risk down. And so the facilities will have to come into compliance with that new rule. And when they do, then that risk will come down.
Madeline, Alejandra, I think this one might be for you, but there were some questions asking if we already have data regarding the number of cancer cases that have been caused by ETO in the area compared to other areas not exposed to ETO. Do we have any data yet about that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So first, cancer is a very complex disease, and there are many factors that contribute to a person's overall cancer risk. It's very hard to link a specific cancer to just one factor. So we currently aren't aware of any cancer cluster cases related to ethylene oxide. All cancer cases in the state are reported to the Utah Cancer Registry. So we'll be using that data in our statistical cancer review. But again, our review can't link any cancer cases in the area to any specific cause or source.
And if I could just add a little bit too, because I think my colleagues in Utah would agree with this, that it's really important to do this kind of cancer cluster analysis because we can learn a lot of things from it. But all of us we aren't waiting for that, right? We're taking action to try to take steps to reduce the risk ahead of that. And part of that is, at least from EPA's perspective, if we have a definitive cancer cluster study, then that feels like we've waited too long, right? Because our job really is to protect health. So we're trying to take action in the meantime as well.
Great. So this question, Madeline, I think might also be for you, but it could go for you, Rachel, as well. So if the plant has been using ethylene oxide since 2007, and the website that we have at US EPA says that there's no short-term risk, when does it cross over from being a short-term risk? Like, at what point is it now, as a long-term risk, no longer become a short-term risk? And can you kind of walk through that?
I can start, but I don't know if Rachel is welcome to add things. I don't know if there's like an exact moment. but in terms of the way that our scientists think about the toxicology of the chemical, they're looking at different endpoints when they think about the acute risk versus the long-term risk. So, so cancer risk is something that we calculate over that sort of course of 70 years, at least in the way that we do the science. And then the acute exposures are a much shorter time window, sort of almost immediate, couple of days. And I don't know if there's anyone else on the phone that can, or on the panel that could give a little more detail on that. But it really is just sort of looking at different endpoints associated with it. And so we're not seeing those endpoints that are associated with that acute short-term few days exposure that they were talking about sort of in the occupational setting as well.
And I'll just echo that the measurements that we made are well below the acute health risk, like so far below that they're, not even in the same orders of magnitude. So yeah, it is really more on that 70-year time horizon. And obviously the facility hasn't been operating that long. So it's hard to make a definitive, in 30 years, so we're getting closer. We don't really have that kind of data, but no acute health risks currently.
I'd also like to just reiterate that these cancer risk estimates are really to help guide public health action, really.
So Carrie, I think this one might be for you. Someone wants to know these ETO releases is what they're referring to, Matt, that are happening at the facility. Are they releases like they're happening sporadically, or is it a continual release of ETO into the air?
Yeah, from talking with the facility, they operate basically 24 hours a day. And only shut down at short intervals to do maintenance and those sort of actions. So there is not a large fluctuation in emissions per se. They would be fairly constant.
Thanks, Carrie.
At very small levels.
Great. So Madeline, I think this question is for you. The question is asking, why doesn't the facility have a voice now? Why aren't they presenting and sharing their perspective at the meeting tonight?
Sure. So, the meeting tonight, the discussion we're having really now is really about this analysis that EPA has done, but also some of the steps that the state is working on to reduce risk and understand risk. So it's really a meeting with us and the co-regulators that we have a special role to regulate industry in this space. But also part of it is too that we want to make sure that there are a number of these facilities around the country, and I talked about that in my part of the presentation. But we want to do our best to make sure that if you live near one of these facilities that has this higher risk level, that you're getting similar information and that you're sort of getting it presented in a similar way so that you can understand that risk. We think it's important from a transparency perspective, but also from a consistency perspective that we really are trying to give the best information we have to the communities across the country that are impacted.
Thanks, Madeline. So there's another question saying that there are some schools that are close to the BD facility. Do we know if any of the monitoring sites are going to be located at schools? Rachel, is that something that you might be able to speak to?
Yes. So the study that we've completed did include one sampling site at the high school, but that was not a continuous monitor. Like I said, we took one sample every 3 days for a 6-week time period. So those periods have ended and we're still analyzing that data. We need to get it back. Some of it needs to come from the lab to us. But we did take some measurements at the school.
Rachel, the same question goes on to talk about some comments that we'll take back to the team about being concerned about those students being exposed. But there's a follow-up question that asks, is there anything that can be done to help students avoid or mitigate any risks associated with ETO? And so I'm wondering, Madeline, I think this might speak a little bit to the piece that you talked about children being especially vulnerable. Can you kind of talk about how that factors in?
Sure. So one thing that we do sort of know from the data is that, and when we talk about children being especially vulnerable, this might help sort of understand what we mean by that. The sort of about half, a little over half of the risk that we see across a lifetime is actually happening in children up to the age of 16. So that it's sort of like it has more of a risk when you're in those younger ages. Carrie talked a little bit about this in his presentation, but I want to indicate too that one of the things that we're looking at as an agency, so a lot of what we talked about is for people who live nearby, right? Which is looking at that 70-year exposure risk, but you're not in school 100% of the time for 70 years, right? And so a different part of our agency is looking at those risks that might be occurring to folks who maybe they don't live near the facility, but they're doing other things near the facility. And that part of EPA is they're doing their work under a different federal regulation, which is called FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Because ETO is considered a pesticide because it's used to kill germs, bacteria, viruses. So it's actually a pesticide, and then EPA also regulates how pesticides are used. And so the work that they're doing is actually looking at people who might be exposed in settings that aren't 100% of the time. It's like more like school settings or work settings. And so we'll have more information about that analysis in the coming months as well. They won't go community by community, and the way they do their analysis is just a little bit of a different law, and they have to follow the regulation that they have, but they will have some more information for us on better understanding what it might mean to have an exposure at those sort of more like school-like settings or work-like settings.
Rachel, I think this question is for you. But you can pass this to someone else if it's not, but someone had mentioned that they're working with Sandy City. What specifically is anyone doing with Sandy City?
Well, we've been communicating all of this work with them. So basically from day one of our study, we worked closely with the city to gain access to their light poles so that we could sample as close as possible to the facility. They've been aware of the study. We've kept them updated through meetings similar to this that we have very frequently, just so that kind of they know what we're seeing and are in the loop. And I think that's kind of the main way that we've been working with them. Yeah.
And I'll echo that as well. They've been a good partner and met with us frequently. But and they've also been a part of sharing some of this information that we've been reaching out to communities with. Yes, thank you, Sandy City.
So there have been a couple questions asking about the timing of these regulations. Madeline, you mentioned two in particular, and people have questions wanting to know when exactly are these new requirements going to be available?
Do you want me to take that, Carrie, or do you want to take it?
You may know best.
I will take it then. So we anticipate that both the air regulation, which is called the NESHAP, what does it stand for, Carrie? You want to say it out loud so folks can find it?
Yep, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, so there's one called the NESHAP, and then there's one called under FIFRA, and we anticipate that both of those will be out in the coming months. But once they're out, then there's a chance for the public to weigh in. So the NESHAP rule will have 60 to 90 day public comment period. And then typically it takes about a year from that point to get to a final rule. And so that's about the timeline for what we would be expecting.
So we have one more question in the Q&A. I'm about to ask it, but I want to just take this pause now to say that if you have any questions at all, please get those into the Q&A module. We are going to stick around as long as there are still questions. We do have a team of folks working to respond directly to people, but we also want to ask some questions out loud as well. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop those into that Q&A module. So Carrie, I think this one might be for you. And the question is asking, because we don't necessarily know the link between ETO and cancer more specifically, but we recognize that there's a risk. can EPA do anything to try to move this facility or any of these facilities away from populated areas?
Because our regulations aren't as protective of public health as we'd like, there are no regulatory authorities for us to ask the facility to shut down or move or any of those options. The facility is well within their permit and regulations, and they are being proactive to take actions to be ahead of the next rulemaking process. So in short, no.
Thanks, Carrie. So another question that we have here is asking if, and maybe Madeline, you can start with this, but Alejandra, I think you also might have some to add here. Maybe you want to start, but the question is asking if we believe any of the residents surrounding the plant are at an elevated risk of cancer right now, or is it going to take several more years before you're at an elevated risk of cancer?
So I can start, but I'd love Alejandra to add because she certainly knows the community better. But I think there's a sort of underlying piece of this question, right, of what is risk and what is outcome. So I think there is elevated risk now, but that doesn't mean that it is absolute that someone will get cancer, right? Risk is about a probability, right? So there's an increased chance that you would get cancer if you live near this facility now, but the degree to which that increases, right, is how long you're exposed, right? And so, you know, the levels for a short period of time of that increase is probably not that high, right? But if you're exposed for a long period of time, it gets to a place where it's concerning to EPA. I don't know if you have more to add, Alejandra, if I confuse things even further, but.
Nope. No, yeah, so again, as Carrie mentioned, this is, you know, a theoretical worst case scenario, again, to be very protective of public health. There is risk, but these cancer risk estimates let us know that we should be taking action to reduce these emissions to lower that risk. So the actual risk is likely much lower because BD Medical hasn't been around for 70 years. But again, we're wanting to prevent, you know, those cancer clusters of happening, and we're taking action now and being proactive about it.
So I want to pause again because that is all the questions that we currently have in the Q&A that we've received from that Q&A module. So I want to give folks another couple minutes here. If you have any other questions, please use that Q&A module. It's right in the center of your screen and it says Q&A. While I'm going to give that another minute, Madeline, one thing that we got a question about, and Carrie, I think either of you might be suited to answer this, but I saw that some of our team was answering this directly, but we did get this question a few times, was trying to understand a little bit more what we mean about that the 3,000 in a million or the 100 in a million. There were some kind of numbers that were talked about as far as our risk assessments was concerned. Could you all explain that one more time just for folks to understand what do we mean by those numbers when we say that?
Do you want me to take it, Carrie? Do you want to take it?
Yeah, you can go first. I'll add if needed.
So it is a little bit challenging to explain this concept, right? Because it's really a concept that's based on what we need, the analysis that we need to set a regulation that will be protective of people's health at a level that that we feel is workable under the Clean Air Act, under the rule we have, the law we have. But what it means is, in order to do that analysis, we take the amount of ETO that's coming out, and we project if a million people were to breathe that amount of ETO that's coming out of the facility for 70 years, 100% of the time, how many of them would get cancer in addition to how many people would get cancer anyway, right? So it's not a super realistic way to think of it if you're trying to think about what it means for the community of Sandy, because there aren't that many people that live in that highest risk area, as well as the fact that that, you know, as we've already discussed, you're not going to be exposed 100% of the time for 70 years. But it's a way for us to sort of benchmark where we think we need to take further action. And I think Alejandra made this point a few times too, that, you know, this is concerning to us. The levels that we're seeing are concerning to us, but it doesn't translate super easily to what it means for a single individual. And so we tried to share some of the things that you could think about in order to try to translate that into what it might mean for you. But again, to sort of understand your risk from ETO, you have to think about how much you're actually breathing in, how long you're breathing it for. And when you're close to the facility, keep in mind, you're going to be breathing in more of it, right? And so those are the things that I would try to think about if I was trying to imagine what it might mean for me. I don't know if that helped. I know I sort of reiterated some of the things we said before, but sometimes just sort of talking through it a little bit can help. But Carrie, if there's anything you want to add, I welcome it.
I think you nailed it.
So we do have another question, and I just want to note that there are different viewpoints in the Q&A that we're going to take back. There are some people that feel like us sharing this information is alarmist. There's others that feel just feel the opposite. They're extremely concerned about the information that we're sharing. And I think we all recognize that people understand and feel risk differently. But the specific question is, what specifically should residents be doing with the information that we've provided? What is the action for them following tonight's webinar?
So I mean, one thing that I hope residents will do is be involved in the process, right? I hope residents will make sure and hold us accountable, hold me accountable, hold Carrie accountable to the fact that we are going to get this action to reduce the risk. And so I would ask for you to stay informed about this, be a part of the rulemaking. So when I mentioned that, and Carrie talked through the public comment period for the rule, we really want to see more engagement from communities if possible on this rulemaking, because we know it has such importance to communities. So we're trying to make this information available now so that folks can have the time to learn about the process and learn about how to do that. And we have some resources online, and maybe we can type in, share that resource in the chat, Taylor, the link that talks about how to do public comments for air regulations. But that's what I would like to see from the community is involvement and helping to make sure that we do in fact achieve the goals of reducing risk.
And I'll add that, as Taylor alluded to, people perceive risk very differently. But our intention for this presentation is to inform you so that you can make decisions affecting your own health. So you know the information we have, and you can assess your risk based on the information we have and what is best for you and your families. So, yeah.
Thanks, Carrie. So this question is wanting to clarify, and maybe Rachel, you can answer this. The BD facility, it started operating in 2007. Is that your understanding?
Yes, yeah, they slowly ramped up their production starting in 2007.
Great. The question kind of that followed this was, so it seems like people have been exposed to ETO for 15 years, and there were some concerns that we're kind of presenting this as it's a new risk, but in reality, wouldn't it have been a risk for the last 15 years while the facility's been operating? And then the follow-up question to that was, if so, is the risk information we're sharing today representative of all 15 years or just maybe a specific point in time?
Sure. So it's my understanding that the cancer analysis is based on the most recent emissions, which are kind of like the best that we can do with the information that we're given. And so it is very protective, assuming that you're being exposed for those 70 years, 24/7 at current levels. And so, again, this is a personal calculation a bit that you do with your own personal risk. But as far as 15 years go, I would say that it's far less than the 70-year lifetime exposure risk that we're quoting here. And that risk is a very protective number. So it's true that the facility is not new, but I don't think that 15 years is the same as a 70-year exposure.
And maybe Carrie, could you clarify then, when we say that's based on current emissions or current information, Is that 1 year? Is that 5 years? And can you just explain what we mean?
Say that one more time. Sorry.
So can you just explain what we mean when Rachel is saying it's based off of current emissions from the facility? Is it 1 year of data from the facility? Is it 1 month of data? Like, can you kind of walk through that?
So we have multiple years of data, but our latest analysis has been on the last year of data from the facility. And I do want to hit on a point from the previous question that we're under this study that we just conducted is new, and that's where we're saying that this is a newer risk that we now understand, but the risk has occurred since 2007.
Or if I could just rephrase that, because I think it's
Yes,
the same point, but that we're here tonight because we didn't know about this before, right? We didn't realize that there was risk in Sandy until more recently. And there are a few reasons for that. Some of them I think we talked through already. One is that ETO was more toxic. We learned it was more toxic than we previously thought. But we also learned some things about where exactly that toxicity might be impacting communities. And we learned that commercial sterilizers were a potential source of risk for communities. And then we looked a little in more detail at which commercial sterilizers might be at risk. And that's the information that Carrie was just mentioning, that we really have some pretty detailed analysis that suggests that there might be risk near this facility and some others. And so that's why we're here with that. But yes, the risk has been going on since ETO has been in use.
I think just to add one more thing, we mentioned that BD Medical is, installing more controls, and it's a process of getting the equipment through supply chains and installing it, and then, testing it to make sure that it's working correctly. But as soon as their emissions are updated, EPA will redo this modeling and this risk assessment and update the website. That's my understanding anyway.
I don't know if we're going to remodel, but we will update the website with the information that we have available to say where we think the risk has probably gone. So it's somewhere in between. But I'm not the modeler, so I can't promise on their behalf that they will do that.
Understood.
They're focused on getting the regulation in place right now. So.
Great. Okay, so we don't have any other questions in the question and answer module here. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Catherine to pull up our closing slide, which has our website information and our contact information. If folks did type a question in and you're still waiting for a response, or you have other questions, go ahead and type that in now. But for those, as we sign off, as you leave tonight, if you still have other questions, you can still email us at eto@epa.gov. And you can also look on our website. So both of those resources are available for you, our website and that email address. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. We are recording this, and so we will make that available. And I appreciate everyone so much for coming. And again, if we didn't get to your question tonight, please reach out, eto@epa.gov. Thank you all. Have a good night.